Have you ever noticed how the things you truly believe seem to show up everywhere in your life? Not by magic, but by the way your mind starts to focus, expect, and act. Some ideas suggest that belief isn't just passive hope. It's a mental force that shapes what we pursue and what we notice. When faith mixes with emotion and repeated thought, desire begins to feel less like a wish and more like something already in motion. And that simple shift may be far more powerful than most people realize. So what exactly is faith in this context? Not the vague kind people talk about when they say, just believe. Here, faith is described as something far more practical. It's presented as a state of mind, a condition you can build deliberately, something that grows stronger through repetition, emotion, and persistent thought until the mind begins to treat it as reality. Think about that for a moment. Most people treat faith like a mysterious gift, something you either have or you don't. But the idea here turns that assumption upside down. Faith isn't described as an accident of personality. It's something that can be developed, cultivated, strengthened over time. And the mechanism that develops it is surprisingly simple. Repeated thought. Not just casual thinking, though, the kind of thought that carries emotion with it. Because according to this philosophy, thoughts by themselves are weak signals. They pass through the mind all day long, thousands of them. But when a thought is mixed with emotion, when it carries feeling, when it is repeated again and again, something different begins to happen. The mind starts to accept it. And once the mind accepts an idea as true, it begins to act on it. That is where faith enters the picture. Faith, in this sense, is the emotional conviction that something will happen even before physical evidence appears. It's the feeling of certainty that transforms an ordinary desire into a driving force. Without that emotional conviction, desire stays weak. It remains a wish, a pleasant thought. Something interesting to imagine, but not something powerful enough to shape action. But when faith enters the picture, desire begins to take on life. It begins to influence the subconscious mind, and that's where the real shift occurs. The subconscious mind is described as a kind of internal workshop, a place where thoughts are accepted, organized, and eventually turned into actions, plans, and habits. But here's the important part. The subconscious mind doesn't analyze thoughts the way the conscious mind does. It doesn't debate them. It doesn't question them. Instead, it responds to what it is repeatedly fed, especially when those thoughts carry emotion. So when a person continually repeats an idea, especially with feeling and belief, the subconscious mind gradually absorbs that idea. Over time, it begins to treat that thought as a command. And once that happens, the mind begins working to express it in reality. This is why faith is described as the head chemist of the mind. It acts like the catalyst that gives thoughts energy. You can imagine two people holding the exact same goal. Both say they want success. Both say they want wealth. Both say they want a better life. But inside their minds, the emotional chemistry is different. One person says it casually. They speak about it as a distant possibility. Their words carry doubt, uncertainty, maybe even quiet disbelief. The other person speaks about the same goal with conviction. The idea feels real to them. They see it. They feel it. They expect it. Outwardly, the goal might be identical, but internally, the mental vibration is completely different. And according to this philosophy, the subconscious mind responds to that internal vibration. Faith gives the thought intensity. Emotion gives the thought movement. And repetition gives the thought permanence. When those three combine, the mind begins translating desire into action. This is why emotions are treated as such powerful forces. Among all the emotions people experience, three are described as especially influential: faith, love, and desire linked to physical passion. Each of these emotions carries enormous intensity. When they blend with thought, they amplify it. They color the idea with feeling. And that feeling is what allows the subconscious mind to receive the message clearly. Without emotion, thoughts drift. With emotion, thoughts move. That difference might sound subtle, but it changes everything. Think about moments in your life when you felt something deeply. Maybe excitement, maybe determination, maybe love for someone important to you. In those moments, your mind became focused in a way that ordinary thinking rarely achieves. Ideas felt sharper, your attention narrowed, your motivation increased. That's the type of emotional energy being described here. When faith combines with a thought, the mind stops treating the idea as speculation. It begins treating it as something inevitable. And that internal shift begins influencing behavior in ways that are often invisible at first. You begin noticing opportunities that previously went unnoticed. You begin taking actions that once felt uncertain. Your persistence grows stronger. Your willingness to keep moving forward increases. From the outside, it can appear mysterious. People may say someone is lucky, or gifted, or somehow favored by circumstances. But internally, the process is far more mechanical. The mind is simply responding to what it has accepted as true. This is why the development of faith is connected directly to the principle of suggestion, specifically the idea of giving repeated instructions to the subconscious mind. When you repeatedly affirm a goal, visualize it, and feel it emotionally, you are effectively programming the mind to accept that outcome as normal. And once the subconscious mind accepts it, it begins searching for ways to bring that idea into physical form. But here's an important detail. The subconscious mind does not distinguish between constructive thoughts and destructive ones. It responds to both. If someone repeatedly fills their mind with fear, doubt, expectations of failure, those thoughts also carry emotion. They also reach the subconscious mind, and eventually the mind begins translating those ideas into reality as well. This explains why some people feel trapped in cycles of misfortune. They may believe they are simply unlucky, that circumstances are stacked against them. But underneath that belief often lies a pattern of repeated negative expectation. The mind has accepted the idea of failure, and once it does, it unconsciously organizes behavior in ways that reinforce that belief. This is not punishment. It is simply the mind following instructions. The same mechanism that can build success can also create limitation. The difference lies in the emotional tone of the thoughts we repeat most often. When someone believes deeply that they are capable, that opportunities exist, that their goal is achievable, those thoughts eventually form a mental environment where faith grows naturally. And once that environment forms, the subconscious mind begins responding immediately to instructions that align with that belief. This is why faith is often described as the starting point of achievement, not because it magically produces results, but because it changes the internal state from which action emerges. When a person truly believes something is possible, their actions begin to align with that belief. Their persistence strengthens, their creativity expands, their willingness to attempt new solutions increases. Over time, these shifts accumulate. Small actions lead to larger actions. Opportunities begin to appear where none were noticed before, and eventually, results begin to follow. What makes this process fascinating is that faith itself can begin as something artificial. At first, the belief may feel uncertain, maybe even forced. Someone might repeat a goal aloud. They might visualize success. They might tell themselves that they believe in their ability to achieve something, even while part of them still doubts. But repetition gradually changes that feeling. The mind begins to adapt to the new idea. The emotional resistance weakens, and eventually the belief begins to feel natural. The thought no longer feels like imagination. It begins to feel like expectation. That moment, the moment expectation replaces doubt, is when faith becomes powerful. Because from that point forward, the mind begins working with a different assumption about the future. Instead of asking, "Can this happen?" the mind begins asking, "How will this happen?" And that subtle shift in questioning opens the door to planning, creativity, and persistent effort. The philosophy behind this idea suggests that once faith reaches that level, the subconscious mind begins responding almost immediately to the instructions it receives. Ideas begin forming, plans begin appearing. Sometimes suddenly, almost like flashes of inspiration. Other times gradually through small realizations that accumulate over time. But those plans only appear after the mind has accepted the possibility of success. Without that acceptance, the mind often dismisses opportunities before they are even explored. That is why the repeated emotionalization of thought is emphasized so strongly. Faith is not built through casual belief. It is built through practice. through repetition, through the deliberate habit of feeding the mind ideas that support the outcome you desire, and through the conscious decision to encourage positive emotional states rather than allowing negative ones to dominate. When a mind becomes dominated by positive emotions, hope, confidence, enthusiasm, love, it becomes receptive to faith. But when negative emotions dominate fear, jealousy, resentment, doubt, the mind closes itself to that possibility. This is why managing the emotional environment of the mind is considered essential. Not in the sense of pretending life is always perfect, but in the sense of consciously choosing which ideas deserve to be reinforced. Because every repeated idea eventually becomes part of the mental framework that guides action, and the mind always moves in the direction of its strongest beliefs. This is the quiet power behind faith. It does not operate through sudden miracles. It operates through the slow transformation of thought into conviction, conviction into behavior, and behavior into results. And once that chain begins moving, desire is no longer just a dream. It becomes a force that pulls the mind and everything it influences toward attainment. There's a strange truth about the human mind that most people don't notice until someone points it out. If you repeat an idea long enough, you begin to believe it. It doesn't even matter at first whether the idea is true or false. The simple act of repetition has a quiet power. Over time, the mind stops questioning and starts accepting. Think about how this works in everyday life. A person hears something again and again, maybe from friends, maybe from family, maybe from the environment they grew up in. A statement gets repeated often enough that eventually it stops sounding like an opinion and starts sounding like a fact. I'm not good with money. People like me never get ahead. Success is for someone else. At first, those might just be thoughts, passing remarks, things said half-jokingly. But if they are repeated day after day, year after year, something subtle begins to change. The mind absorbs them, and once the mind accepts them as truth, behavior begins to follow that belief. This is where the idea of autosuggestion comes into the picture. Autosuggestion simply means influencing your own mind through repeated thought. It's the process of feeding ideas to yourself until they take root in the subconscious. You can think of it like planting seeds in soil. Every thought you repeat is a seed. Some seeds grow into confidence, determination, and possibility. Others grow into fear, doubt, and limitation. But here's the striking part. The subconscious mind does not judge the seeds. It doesn't stop and ask whether a thought is helpful or harmful. It doesn't analyze truth or falsehood. It simply grows whatever is planted there repeatedly. If strong positive thoughts are planted and reinforced with emotion, those thoughts grow. If negative thoughts are planted with equal emotional intensity, they grow too. The soil does not discriminate, and that's why the process of repetition matters so much. According to this philosophy, any idea that is repeatedly passed to the subconscious mind eventually becomes accepted. Once accepted, the subconscious begins working to translate that idea into physical reality through the most practical means available. In other words, belief shapes behavior, and behavior shapes results. But there's another ingredient that determines how quickly a thought takes root. Emotion. Emotion gives a thought life. Imagine two statements spoken by the same person. One is repeated flatly without feeling. The other is repeated with excitement, fear, or conviction. Which one is more likely to stick? The emotional one. Emotion adds intensity to thought. It energizes the idea, making it more vivid in the mind. This is why emotionalized thoughts mixed with feeling are said to reach the subconscious more quickly than thoughts spoken without emotion. The mind responds to feeling. That's true whether the emotion is positive or negative. Faith, love, hope, enthusiasm. These emotions strengthen constructive ideas. Fear, jealousy, resentment, and doubt strengthen destructive ones. But both operate under the same law. The mind responds to whatever is repeated with emotional force, and this leads to one of the most unsettling insights in the entire philosophy. The subconscious mind does not distinguish between positive and negative instructions. It acts upon both. If someone repeatedly tells themselves they are capable, worthy, and determined to succeed, the subconscious begins shaping behavior around that belief. But if someone repeatedly convinces themselves that failure is inevitable, that belief becomes the blueprint instead. The subconscious will work just as diligently to prove that belief true. This idea helps explain a mystery that has puzzled many people throughout life. Why do some individuals seem to attract misfortune again and again? Why do certain patterns of failure repeat themselves even when someone wants something different? From this perspective, the answer is often hidden in the person's dominant thoughts. If the mind is filled with fear, with expectations of loss, with the belief that success belongs to others, those ideas gradually become instructions to the subconscious. And the subconscious obeys. Not out of cruelty, not out of fate. Simply because it responds to what it has been told repeatedly. This is why some people come to believe that a mysterious force is holding them back. They feel as though life is working against them. But what they often overlook is the quiet pattern of thoughts they have been feeding their minds for years. Thoughts filled with doubt. Thoughts filled with worry. Thoughts that assume disappointment before effort even begins. Once those thoughts become dominant, the subconscious treats them as reality. And reality begins to mirror that expectation. That is why misfortune is sometimes described as something people unconsciously create, not intentionally, not knowingly, but through the repeated acceptance of limiting beliefs. And the same process works in the opposite direction. When someone repeatedly fills their mind with constructive thoughts, when they affirm goals, imagine success, and attach emotion to those ideas, the subconscious mind begins working toward those outcomes instead. Gradually, behavior changes. Confidence grows. Actions become more consistent, and persistence increases. The person may not even realize how much their mindset has shifted, but others often notice. They might say, "You seem different lately, more certain, more focused, more willing to move forward." That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened through repetition, through the steady reinforcement of new ideas until the subconscious mind accepted them as the natural direction of life. This is why the mind is often compared to a fertile garden. In a garden, plants grow wherever seeds are planted. If you plant roses, roses grow. If you plant weeds, or if you simply allow weeds to take root without planting anything else, they grow just as quickly. The garden doesn't decide what deserves to grow. It simply responds to what is present. The human mind behaves in much the same way. If constructive ideas are planted deliberately, they grow. If destructive ideas are allowed to accumulate unchecked, they grow as well. The difference lies in awareness. Most people go through life allowing random influences to shape their thoughts. Conversations, news, criticism, fear, unexamined assumptions. These influences plant seeds without the person realizing it, and over time those seeds become beliefs. Beliefs become habits. Habits become destiny. But the moment someone becomes aware of this process, something powerful happens. They realize they can choose what thoughts to plant. They can choose what ideas deserve repetition. And through that repetition, they can begin reshaping the internal environment of the mind. This is the core purpose of autosuggestion. It's not simply positive thinking. It's a deliberate practice of influencing the subconscious through repeated emotionalized thought. When used consciously, it allows a person to replace destructive patterns with constructive ones. Instead of repeating doubts, they repeat intention. Instead of reinforcing fear, they reinforce determination. And over time, the emotional tone of the mind changes. That new emotional tone becomes the atmosphere in which new beliefs grow. Beliefs that support effort instead of undermining it. Beliefs that encourage action instead of hesitation. But the process requires persistence. Because the subconscious mind rarely accepts new instructions instantly. It accepts them through repetition, again and again, until the idea feels familiar, until it feels normal, until it begins to replace the older beliefs that once dominated. At that point, the new thought pattern becomes the guiding force of behavior. The individual begins to act differently without consciously forcing themselves. Their expectations change. Their responses to challenges change. Even their interpretation of events begins to shift. What once looked like failure may begin to look like feedback. What once looked like impossibility may begin to look like a puzzle waiting to be solved. all because the subconscious mind is now operating under a different set of instructions. The same principle explains why negative environments can be so powerful. If a person spends years surrounded by pessimism, criticism, and fear, those emotional messages become repeated suggestions. They eventually sink into the subconscious mind. Once there, they influence the person's sense of what is possible, even if the person consciously wants something better. That internal conflict can feel frustrating. Part of the mind wants progress. Another part quietly expects failure. And until those hidden expectations are replaced through deliberate repetition of new ideas, the conflict remains. This is why the philosophy emphasizes conscious control over the thoughts allowed to dominate the mind, because dominant thoughts eventually become dominant beliefs, and dominant beliefs shape outcomes. The encouraging part of this principle is that the same mechanism responsible for limitation can also be used for growth. The subconscious mind responds to repeated thought, no matter where the thought comes from. If someone deliberately feeds it constructive ideas filled with belief and emotional conviction, it will eventually accept them. And once accepted, the subconscious begins turning those ideas into action. Plans appear, motivation increases, opportunities become visible, and persistence grows stronger. Not because of luck, not because of chance, but because the mind is finally working in harmony with the goal instead of quietly resisting it. This is the quiet power behind repetition and autosuggestion. Every repeated idea is a message. Every emotional thought is a command. And every command eventually becomes part of the blueprint that shapes the direction of life. Whether those commands build success or reinforce failure depends entirely on what we allow to take root in the garden of the mind. At some point in life, almost everyone runs into the same invisible obstacle. It isn't lack of opportunity, it isn't lack of intelligence, and it often isn't even lack of effort. It's something quieter than that, a lingering uncertainty about oneself. A voice that whispers sometimes softly, sometimes loudly, that maybe you're not quite capable enough, not prepared enough, not confident enough to do the thing you're dreaming about. And what makes this obstacle difficult is that it lives inside the mind. It shapes decisions in subtle ways. It causes hesitation where action might otherwise appear. It creates second-guessing just when conviction is needed most. But the philosophy behind this part of the script makes an important claim. Self-confidence is not something reserved for a lucky few. It is not a personality trait granted at birth. It is something that can be built, deliberately. And the method for building it begins with something surprisingly simple: the deliberate training of the mind through suggestion. The idea is based on a principle we've already explored. The mind eventually believes what it repeatedly hears and feels. When certain thoughts are allowed to dominate the inner conversation long enough, those thoughts gradually become convictions. And convictions shape behavior. If a person repeatedly feeds the mind doubt, hesitation, and fear, the mind begins to treat those ideas as instructions. Confidence shrinks. Initiative disappears. Even strong ability becomes hidden behind uncertainty. But the reverse can also happen. If a person deliberately plants thoughts of capability, persistence, and belief, if those ideas are repeated often enough, and with genuine feeling, something inside begins to shift. At first, the change may be small: a slightly stronger willingness to try, a slightly quieter voice of doubt. But repetition builds momentum. Gradually, the mind begins to accept the new story it has been told. And this is where the concept of a written self-confidence formula enters the picture. The purpose of the formula is not magical. It isn't a charm or a superstition. It is a structured way to train the mind by directing its attention toward constructive beliefs about oneself and one's future. In essence, the formula becomes a set of instructions that are repeatedly delivered to the subconscious mind. But those instructions are not vague affirmations. They are specific commitments. The first idea behind the formula is the recognition that you possess the ability to achieve your purpose in life. Not a guarantee that success will come easily, but a recognition that capability exists within you, waiting to be expressed through persistent effort. And that recognition leads to a demand you make of yourself, a demand for continuous action. Because belief without action is only wishful thinking. The formula begins by reinforcing the idea that achievement requires persistence, that progress is created through steady movement even when results are not immediately visible. This alone is powerful. When someone begins repeating the idea that they are capable and responsible for persistent effort, the mind slowly begins to reorganize itself around that expectation. Instead of asking whether effort is worthwhile, the mind begins to assume effort is necessary. The second idea within the formula turns attention toward another powerful truth. The dominating thoughts of the mind eventually express themselves in physical reality. In other words, what you allow your mind to dwell on most often eventually shows up in the way you act and the outcomes you create. This means that controlling your thoughts is not just a philosophical exercise, it is practical strategy. If your mind constantly imagines failure, the body will unconsciously behave in ways that support that expectation. If your mind consistently imagines capability and progress, the body begins acting in ways that support those ideas instead. So the formula introduces a daily practice. A period of time dedicated to thinking about the person you intend to become, not the person you fear you might be, not the person others assume you are, but the version of yourself you consciously choose to build. During that time, the mind forms a mental image of that future identity. The confidence, the ability, the character, the habits. By repeating that image again and again, the mind gradually accepts it as something real. And once the mind accepts it, behavior begins to shift in alignment with that image. The third element of the formula returns to the principle of desire. Any desire that remains in the mind long enough will eventually seek expression through some practical means. That is why the formula encourages the practice of demanding self-confidence from oneself each day, not waiting passively for it to appear, not hoping it might arrive someday, but actively instructing the mind to develop it. 10 minutes of focused thought can seem small in the course of a day, but when those 10 minutes are repeated consistently, the cumulative effect becomes powerful. Each repetition strengthens the message being sent to the subconscious mind. And slowly, the mind begins adjusting to the expectation of confidence rather than the habit of doubt. The fourth part of the formula introduces something equally important: clarity of purpose. It requires that a person write down a clear description of their major goal in life. Not a vague hope, not a passing interest, a definite purpose. And then make a promise that they will never stop working toward that goal until they develop the confidence required to achieve it. There is something psychologically powerful about writing a commitment down. It turns a passing thought into a concrete statement. It makes the goal visible. And when that statement is read repeatedly, it reinforces the seriousness of the intention. The fifth element of the formula adds an ethical dimension that often gets overlooked when people talk about success. It emphasizes that lasting wealth and position cannot endure unless they are built upon truth and fairness. This matters because destructive attitudes, envy, hatred, cynicism, jealousy do more than damage relationships. They poison the emotional environment of the mind. And a mind filled with negative emotion becomes an unfriendly place for faith to grow. So the formula calls for the deliberate cultivation of goodwill toward others, not as a moral slogan, but as a practical strategy for maintaining the kind of emotional atmosphere in which confidence and faith can flourish. When a person removes resentment and replaces it with cooperation, the mind becomes calmer, clearer, more focused, and that emotional stability strengthens belief. The formula also emphasizes the importance of believing in other people, because belief is contagious. When you show confidence in others, they often return that confidence, and the same dynamic applies internally. When you show confidence in yourself through repeated thought and action, the mind gradually reflects that belief back to you. All of these ideas come together in a final instruction. The formula must be repeated aloud, every day, with feeling, and with faith that the process will influence both thoughts and actions over time. The reason for speaking the words aloud is simple. Sound creates a stronger impression on the mind than silent thought alone. Hearing your own voice reinforces the message you are delivering to the subconscious, and repetition strengthens the signal. But the formula alone is not enough. The environment surrounding your mind matters too, because the mind absorbs influences constantly, from conversations, from media, from people around you, from the attitudes you encounter every day. If negative influences dominate that environment, they slowly erode confidence, criticism, pessimism, fearful thinking. All of these can become repeated suggestions if they are allowed to linger in the mind. That is why guarding your mental environment becomes essential. Not by isolating yourself from reality, but by becoming selective about which ideas deserve your attention. Encouraging positive emotions and discouraging destructive ones creates a mental atmosphere where faith can grow. A mind dominated by constructive emotion becomes receptive to confident instruction. It accepts suggestions more readily. It responds faster, and it acts with greater certainty. But perhaps the most important message in this section is this: faith does not appear suddenly. It is developed through practice, through repetition, through the deliberate habit of directing your thoughts toward the outcomes you want rather than the fears you want to avoid. This process can feel awkward at first. Many people discover that controlling their thoughts is more difficult than they expected. Old habits of thinking resist change. Doubt returns. Negative influences creep back into the mind. But persistence gradually weakens those habits, and with enough repetition, new habits replace them. Eventually, the mind begins operating from a new baseline of confidence. At that point, faith becomes less of an effort and more of a natural state. The mind simply assumes progress is possible, and that assumption becomes the foundation for action. It is easy to dismiss practices like this as simple optimism, but the deeper idea behind them is about training attention. What you focus on repeatedly becomes the center of your thinking, and what becomes the center of your thinking eventually becomes the center of your life. That is the turning point described in this philosophy, the moment when a person stops drifting through thoughts shaped by circumstance and begins deliberately shaping those thoughts themselves. When that moment arrives, something subtle but powerful changes. You begin to realize that confidence is not something you wait for. It is something you build, one thought at a time, one repetition at a time, until the belief you once practiced deliberately becomes the belief you carry naturally. And once that belief settles into the subconscious mind, it begins guiding your actions in ways that make your purpose feel not only possible, but inevitable. There are moments in history that seem almost impossible when you first hear about them. Moments when one individual with no obvious power somehow moves millions of people, reshapes the direction of a nation, or awakens something powerful inside themselves that had been quiet for years. When we look closely at those moments, a pattern begins to appear. Again and again, the force behind them is not simply intelligence or resources or even strategy. It is belief. A kind of belief so strong that it refuses to accept the limitations everyone else assumes are permanent. And once that belief becomes intense enough, it begins to affect more than the person who holds it. It begins to spread. It influences others. It turns into a shared conviction that pulls people forward together. History gives us countless examples of this strange and powerful phenomenon, but a few stand out with unusual clarity. Consider the life of Abraham Lincoln. Today, his name feels monumental, almost inevitable. His story is taught in schools, repeated in books, carved into statues and memorials. It can be easy to imagine that his rise was always destined, but that picture leaves out something important. For much of his early life, Lincoln appeared to be the opposite of destined for greatness. He faced defeat repeatedly. Business ventures failed. Political campaigns collapsed. Personal loss struck him deeply. At several points in his life, discouragement pressed so heavily upon him that many people around him believed his ambitions were finished. To outside observers, these setbacks looked like proof that success simply was not meant for him. Yet something inside Lincoln refused to accept that conclusion. Despite repeated disappointments, he continued to carry a quiet conviction about his purpose. He believed deeply and persistently that he had a role to play in shaping the future of his country. That belief did not erase the hardships he faced, but it changed the way he responded to them. Instead of interpreting failure as the end of the road, he treated it as part of a longer journey. Each defeat became something to learn from, rather than something to surrender to. And gradually, that stubborn persistence awakened abilities within him that had once remained hidden. The confidence to speak with greater clarity. The courage to stand by convictions even when the crowd disagreed. The patience to continue moving forward while others gave up. Over time, that inner transformation changed the trajectory of his life. The man once dismissed as an unsuccessful politician became one of the most influential leaders in American history. What makes this transformation fascinating is that the turning point did not begin with power or position. It began with a belief strong enough to survive disappointment, a belief strong enough to keep moving forward when every external signal seemed to say, stop. And that kind of belief does something remarkable. It begins to wake up abilities that were always present but never fully activated. You could think of it like a sleeping engine inside the mind. The potential is there, but without a spark, the engine remains idle. Faith becomes that spark. It energizes the mind. It gives direction to effort. It turns scattered abilities into organized action. But belief does not only transform the individual who holds it. When it grows strong enough, it begins to influence others. And this is where the story of another remarkable figure comes into view: Mahatma Gandhi. Unlike the rulers and generals who dominated the political landscape of his time, Gandhi possessed none of the traditional tools of power. He commanded no armies. He controlled no treasury. He owned no vast network of weapons or military resources. By the usual standards of political influence, he should have been insignificant. Yet something extraordinary happened. Through nothing more than conviction, clarity of purpose, and unwavering belief in a vision of independence, he inspired hundreds of millions of people to move together in pursuit of change. Imagine the scale of that influence for a moment. 200 million minds. 200 million individuals with different lives, different worries, different backgrounds. And yet they were drawn together by a shared belief. Not by fear, not by force, but by faith in a vision. That vision centered on a powerful idea that unity, discipline, and peaceful resistance could accomplish what violence and warfare could not. Many people initially doubted that approach. They believed only military strength could overcome a powerful empire. But Gandhi's conviction never wavered. He believed deeply that moral courage could mobilize people more effectively than weapons ever could. And because he believed it so completely, others began to believe it too. That is the contagious nature of conviction. When a person carries belief with absolute clarity, their certainty becomes visible. It shows up in their voice, their actions, their persistence. People feel it. And when enough people feel it, belief spreads like a current moving through a crowd. One person becomes 10. 10 become 100. 100 become millions. Before long, a movement forms around what was once just an idea in the mind of one individual. This phenomenon appears again and again throughout history. Leaders who awaken belief inside themselves eventually awaken belief in others. Their confidence becomes a signal that invites cooperation. Their clarity of purpose creates direction where confusion once existed. And as more people join that shared purpose, something powerful begins to emerge. Collective energy. When individuals align their efforts around the same vision, their combined strength becomes far greater than anything they could accomplish alone. That is why leadership built on faith and cooperation tends to endure longer than leadership built on fear. Fear can force obedience for a time, but belief inspires willing participation, and willing participation unlocks creativity, initiative, and dedication that no command can produce. The philosophy behind this idea suggests that the most enduring forms of power come from the ability to unite minds rather than control them. When people feel that their efforts contribute to a meaningful purpose, their energy multiplies. They begin to see themselves not as isolated individuals, but as part of something larger. And once that feeling takes hold, remarkable achievements become possible. You can see this principle not only in politics or social movements, but also in everyday leadership. In communities, in workplaces, in families. A leader who communicates genuine belief in a shared goal often awakens hidden potential in the people around them. Someone who once felt ordinary may begin to act with extraordinary commitment when they feel their work matters. Someone who once hesitated may begin taking initiative when they sense the trust placed in them. Belief spreads outward. First, it transforms the leader. Then it influences the group. Eventually, it reshapes the environment itself. And this process explains something curious about the way influence works. Many people assume authority creates belief, but in reality, belief often creates authority. When a person demonstrates unwavering conviction and consistent action toward a purpose, others begin to recognize that dedication. They begin to trust it. And trust becomes the foundation of influence. This is why emotional energy plays such an important role in leadership. Ideas alone rarely move people, but ideas infused with emotion, hope, courage, determination can ignite movements. Emotion carries energy. Energy attracts attention, and attention opens the door for ideas to spread. That combination of thought and emotion creates what might be called magnetic influence. People feel drawn toward the clarity of purpose they see in others. They begin asking questions. They begin imagining possibilities they had not considered before. And once that imagination awakens, participation follows. The result can be profound. Entire communities reorganize themselves around a shared belief. Industries evolve. Societies change direction. All because one person carried an idea strongly enough to awaken belief in others. And when we step back and look at these stories from Lincoln to Gandhi and countless others, we begin to notice the same underlying truth. Faith is not merely an internal feeling. It is a force that moves outward. It activates ability within the individual, and it activates cooperation within the group. Once both of those forces begin working together, the scale of what becomes possible expands dramatically. A single determined mind can accomplish impressive things. But many minds united by shared conviction can reshape entire nations. This is why belief, emotion, and purpose are described as the true engines of influence. Not wealth, not authority, not even intelligence alone. Those things can amplify influence once it exists. But the spark that ignites everything is belief. Belief in a goal. Belief in a possibility. Belief strong enough to move forward even when doubt surrounds it. Once that belief takes hold, it becomes difficult to contain. It travels through conversations, through actions, through the quiet example of persistence. And somewhere along the way, other people begin to feel it too. What once lived in the imagination of a single individual becomes a shared vision carried by many. And that is when the true power of faith reveals itself, not as a solitary force, but as a catalyst that awakens the hidden strength inside individuals and connects them through a common purpose. When that happens, history begins to move, and what once seemed impossible starts to feel inevitable. On a winter evening in December of 1900, something extraordinary began to unfold inside a quiet banquet hall in New York City. At first, the gathering looked like any other formal dinner among the financial elite of the era. The room was filled with some of the most powerful bankers and investors in the country. Heavy coats were checked at the door, conversations drifted politely across the tables, and waiters moved carefully between courses. Nothing about the evening suggested that history was about to shift. Yet before the night ended, an idea would be set into motion that would help create one of the largest corporations the world had ever seen. And the spark for it all would come from a single man standing up to speak. His name was Charles M. Schwab. At the time, Schwab was a rising figure in the steel industry. Only 38 years old, he had built his reputation working under the legendary industrialist Andrew Carnegie. Though he was well known within business circles in Pittsburgh, he was still something of an outsider among the powerful financial figures gathered in New York that evening. Many of the men seated around the tables were skeptical about him. They had been warned that the young steel executive from the West might speak too boldly, too enthusiastically. Their hosts had quietly suggested that Schwab keep his remarks short and polite, something light that would not disrupt the relaxed atmosphere of the dinner. Some guests expected him to speak for 15 minutes, perhaps 20 at most. Even J.P. Morgan, the towering titan of American finance seated nearby, had not planned to remain for long. But when Schwab finally rose to speak, something unexpected happened. Instead of delivering a routine speech filled with polite remarks, he began painting a vision. Not a vague idea, not a distant possibility, a vivid picture of what the future of the steel industry could become. At the time, the steel business in America was scattered across dozens of competing companies. Many of these firms were small, inefficient, and locked in fierce competition with one another. Each company guarded its territory carefully, often duplicating effort and wasting resources in the struggle for dominance. Schwab saw something different. He believed the entire industry could be reorganized into a single powerful system. Instead of countless smaller companies competing blindly, he imagined a unified enterprise that would bring the strongest steel operations together under one structure. Mills could be streamlined, costs could be reduced, production could expand dramatically. The vision was bold. Some would have called it reckless. But as Schwab spoke, the idea began to take shape in the minds of the men listening to him. He described an industry that would no longer operate through chaos and rivalry, but through coordination and efficiency. He spoke about eliminating unnecessary competition between plants owned by the same interests. He described how specialized mills could focus on what they produced best, increasing output while lowering costs. More importantly, he rejected the old habit of building monopolies simply to drive prices higher. Instead, he argued that lowering the cost of steel would actually expand demand. Cheaper steel would allow new industries to flourish. Railroads, bridges, buildings, machinery, all of them could grow more rapidly if steel became more affordable. In other words, growth would come not from squeezing the market, but from expanding it. The idea was radical for its time, and Schwab delivered it with remarkable energy. Those who listened later described the speech as electrifying. He spoke for 90 minutes, not the 15 minutes his hosts had expected. And when he finished, the room was silent for a moment, not because the audience was bored, because they were thinking. Among them sat J.P. Morgan. Morgan was already one of the most powerful financiers in the world. His influence stretched across railroads, banking, and numerous industries. Yet even Morgan had struggled to solve the puzzle of the steel business. Several men had previously approached him with ideas about consolidating the industry. Each attempt had failed. Some plans were too reckless. Others lacked clarity. Still others involved personalities Morgan simply did not trust. But Schwab's presentation was different. It was detailed, practical, and most importantly, it came from someone who understood the steel business intimately. After the dinner ended, Morgan asked Schwab to join him privately. The two men moved to a quiet corner of the room and sat together near a window. For nearly an hour, they talked. Schwab elaborated on his plan. He explained which companies should be included in the consolidation and which ones should be left out. He described how the combined organization could operate more efficiently than the fragmented system that existed. Morgan listened carefully. When their conversation finally ended, the seed of an idea had been planted. But turning that idea into reality would require far more than an inspiring speech. It would require negotiation, strategy, persistence, and perhaps most difficult of all, it would require persuading Andrew Carnegie to sell the enormous steel empire he had spent decades building. Carnegie's company was the giant of the industry. Without it, any attempt to create a unified steel corporation would remain incomplete. Carnegie knew it, Morgan knew it, and Schwab knew it. But convincing Carnegie to sell would not be easy. The Scottish-born industrialist had built his fortune through relentless ambition and fierce independence. He had little interest in placing his business under the influence of Wall Street financiers. Yet Schwab believed he could persuade him. After his meeting with Morgan, Schwab returned to Pittsburgh and continued managing Carnegie's operations as if nothing unusual had occurred. Behind the scenes, however, the idea was beginning to gather momentum. Morgan studied the proposal carefully. For nearly a week, he analyzed the possibilities, weighing the risks against the enormous potential rewards. Finally, he reached a decision. He would pursue the plan. The next step required bringing Schwab back to New York. Once again, the two men met privately this time, discussing the details of how such a massive consolidation might work. Schwab prepared extensive notes outlining the physical assets and earning capacity of the companies he believed should form the foundation of the new enterprise. Through the night, they studied those numbers. Morgan, his partners, and several trusted advisors examined each figure carefully. They asked questions. They challenged assumptions. But one thing stood out clearly. Schwab knew the steel business better than anyone in the room. When he stated that a company was worth a certain amount, his confidence carried weight. By dawn, the framework for an extraordinary transaction had begun to take shape. Only one question remained. Could Andrew Carnegie be persuaded to sell? Schwab believed he could at least try. Soon afterward, the opportunity came. During a quiet meeting with Carnegie, Schwab began explaining the vision once again. He spoke about the possibilities of a unified steel corporation that could dominate global markets. He described the comfort and freedom Carnegie could enjoy in retirement, along with the enormous financial reward the sale would bring. Carnegie listened, and after considering the proposal, he did something remarkable. He picked up a piece of paper. On it, he wrote a number. Then he handed it to Schwab. That number represented the price at which he would sell his company. Approximately $400 million. At the time, the figure was almost unimaginable. Yet Morgan accepted it. With that agreement in place, the idea that had begun as a speech at a dinner table started transforming into reality. The negotiations that followed were complex and enormous in scale. Multiple steel companies were brought into the arrangement. Financing was organized. Shares were structured. Piece by piece, the components of the new enterprise were assembled. When the process was complete, the United States Steel Corporation was born. It became the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. What had begun as an idea in the mind of Charles M. Schwab had grown into one of the most powerful industrial organizations the world had ever known. But the most fascinating part of the story is not the corporation itself. It is the transformation that occurred between the first spark of imagination and the final outcome. Because the steel mills already existed, the factory's equipment and resources were already there. What changed was the way those resources were organized. An idea rearranged them. A vision combined them. Faith in that vision persuaded others to participate, and persistence carried the plan through countless obstacles until it became reality. The financial results were staggering. The consolidation increased the value of the companies involved by hundreds of millions of dollars almost immediately. A single idea communicated with conviction and executed with planning had produced immense wealth. But the lesson behind the story reaches beyond finance. It illustrates something fundamental about the nature of achievement. Great outcomes rarely begin with physical resources alone. They begin with organized thought. Someone imagines a possibility others have not yet seen. They believe in it strongly enough to express it clearly. They develop a plan for turning that vision into action, and then they pursue it persistently until the world catches up with the idea. The United States Steel story is not simply about industry. It is about the power of belief directed toward a definite purpose. It shows how imagination, when combined with faith and organized planning, can transform intangible thought into enormous tangible results. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that many of the structures shaping our world today once existed only as ideas in someone's mind. Ideas waiting for the moment when belief planning and persistence would bring them to life. Up to this point, we've been talking about faith belief and the strange way repeated thoughts begin shaping the direction of a person's life. But that naturally raises a practical question. If thoughts truly influence outcomes, how does someone intentionally guide those thoughts instead of simply reacting to whatever happens during the day? This is where the principle of autosuggestion comes in. Autosuggestion is not as complicated as it sounds. At its core, it simply means influencing your own mind through deliberate suggestion. It is the process of communicating a chosen idea from the conscious part of your mind into the deeper level where habits, instincts, and automatic behaviors begin to form. Think of it like a message traveling from the surface of your thinking into the deeper machinery that quietly runs much of your life. Most people never realize this communication is happening constantly. Every worry repeated during the day, every fear replayed in the mind before sleep, every discouraging belief accepted without question. All of those become suggestions that slip into the subconscious mind. And once there, they begin shaping expectations. But here's the part. Many people overlook the mind does not only receive suggestions from the outside world, it also receives suggestions from the thoughts you deliberately repeat to yourself. Autosuggestion is the intentional use of that process. Instead of allowing random influences to fill the subconscious, you begin selecting the thoughts that deserve repetition. To understand how this works, it helps to picture the mind as having two main layers. The first layer is the conscious mind. This is the part of you that thinks, deliberately analyzes situations and makes decisions. It's the place where ideas first appear. It is aware, alert, and capable of choosing which thoughts to focus on. In many ways, the conscious mind acts like a gatekeeper. Every experience you encounter passes through this gate first. Conversations, books, criticism, encouragement, worries, ambitions. All of them arrive at the door of conscious awareness. And the conscious mind has the ability to decide which ideas deserve attention. But most people rarely use that power intentionally. Instead, they allow nearly every thought that appears to pass through unchecked. Over time, those repeated thoughts move deeper into the second layer of the mind, the subconscious. If the conscious mind is the gatekeeper, the subconscious is more like fertile ground. Whatever ideas are planted there repeatedly begin to grow. And just like fertile soil, the subconscious does not judge the quality of what is planted. Plant a constructive idea, confidence, ambition, determination, and it grows. Plant a destructive idea, fear, doubt, resentment, and it grows just as easily. The soil itself does not decide, it simply responds. The subconscious mind operates in much the same way. Once an idea reaches it often enough, it begins accepting that idea as a form of instruction. And once accepted, the subconscious begins shaping behavior around it. This is why repeated thoughts eventually become beliefs, and beliefs eventually become habits of action. But for autosuggestion to work effectively, something important must be added to repetition: emotion. Emotion is what gives a thought power. Imagine repeating a sentence over and over without feeling anything about it. The words would pass through your mind like background noise. Your subconscious would barely notice them. But now imagine repeating the same words while feeling excitement, belief, urgency, or gratitude. Suddenly the thought carries energy. The mind recognizes it as significant. Emotion acts like a signal amplifier. It strengthens the message being sent to the subconscious. That is why the instructions surrounding autosuggestion emphasize feeling so strongly. Simply repeating words without emotion rarely produces meaningful results. It becomes a mechanical exercise. The subconscious mind responds not to the words themselves, but to the emotional vibration attached to them. If the words are spoken with doubt, the subconscious absorbs the doubt. If the words are spoken with belief, the subconscious absorbs the belief. The emotional tone determines which version of the message is received. This is why the practice involves more than just speaking a goal aloud. You are encouraged to imagine it vividly, to see the result in your mind, to feel the satisfaction of achieving it, to experience the moment internally before it happens externally. The exercise becomes a kind of rehearsal for success. By repeatedly imagining the outcome, the mind begins treating it as something familiar rather than something distant or impossible. And familiarity reduces resistance. The subconscious begins cooperating with the idea instead of rejecting it. One of the most practical ways to apply this process involves writing a clear statement of your financial goal, not a vague wish for money, a specific amount, a specific deadline, and a clear description of the service or value you intend to give in return. This statement becomes the script you deliver to your subconscious mind. The instructions suggest reading it aloud twice every day, once in the morning, once at night. But while reading it, you are encouraged to do something more powerful than simply repeating the words. You close your eyes and imagine the goal already achieved. You see the money in your possession. You imagine the life it makes possible. You visualize the work you performed to earn it. You picture the services you delivered, the problems you solved, the value you created. In other words, you connect the reward with the contribution that makes it possible. This detail is important. The philosophy behind autosuggestion does not present money as something that appears out of thin air. It treats money as the result of useful service. So when you visualize the goal, you are also visualizing the work that leads to it. This reinforces the idea that achievement comes through exchange value given for value received. By repeating that mental picture every day, the subconscious mind begins searching for ways to turn it into reality. New ideas begin forming. Plans begin appearing. Sometimes these ideas arrive unexpectedly, almost like sudden inspiration. Other times they appear gradually as you think through possibilities and notice opportunities around you. But the important part is that the subconscious becomes engaged in the process. It begins cooperating with the goal. This cooperation often shows up in subtle ways. You might notice opportunities you previously ignored. You might feel more motivated to pursue a certain path. You might suddenly connect ideas that once seemed unrelated. All of these changes come from the subconscious mind aligning with the direction repeatedly suggested to it. Another key part of the process is persistence. The subconscious mind rarely accepts a new idea immediately. Just like a seed planted in soil requires time to grow roots. A repeated thought needs time before it becomes a dominant belief. At first, the practice of autosuggestion may feel artificial. Part of the mind may resist the new idea. Old doubts may return, but repetition gradually weakens those doubts. Each time the goal is repeated with emotion and visualization, the message becomes clearer to the subconscious. Over time, belief grows stronger, and once belief becomes dominant, action begins following naturally. That is why repetition without feeling fails. If someone reads their statement casually without imagining the result, without attaching emotion to it, the subconscious receives only a faint signal. The message is too weak to compete with the stronger emotional thoughts already present in the mind. But when the words are repeated with belief, when the goal is visualized as already real, the signal becomes strong enough to influence deeper mental patterns. Gradually, the subconscious accepts the idea, and once accepted, it begins working quietly in the background to organize behavior in that direction. This process does not eliminate effort. It does not replace planning or action. What it does is prepare the mind to support those actions instead of resisting them. It replaces hesitation with expectation, doubt with possibility, uncertainty with direction. Autosuggestion becomes the bridge between desire and action. The conscious mind chooses the goal. The subconscious mind begins shaping the behavior required to achieve it. And through repetition, emotion, and visualization, the two parts of the mind gradually begin working together. When that happens, desire stops feeling like a distant wish. It begins to feel like a plan already unfolding. So in the end, the idea is simple even if it takes practice to live it. The thoughts you repeat, especially the ones charged with emotion and belief, slowly shape what your mind accepts as possible. And once the mind accepts something, it begins guiding your actions in that direction. That quiet process is how desire starts turning into results. If this perspective made you think a little differently, stay with us, there's much more ahead. And if you found value here, feel free to like and subscribe.